Okay, I want to look at the basics of turning the waist. Ben Lowe's 5 principles: relax, separate, empty, and full, turn the waist, body upright, beautiful lady's hand. So turn the waist is a central, important Tai Chi principle. And one of the keys to it is actually being able to use your hips. So I'm going to look at some exercises for getting actual action in the hips and then understanding how that can actually move the entire body. So the first exercise we'll do is a separated shifting and turning exercise. We learned this from Lindsay Williams, one of Ben Lowe's top students. So start out in a 70-30, waist is right, square ahead. Sit back without turning, all the weight in the back. Now turn towards the corner that your rear foot is pointing towards. Shift forward without turning, and then square back to the front. So this is really simple. You shift, you turn, you shift, you turn. And you can do this on both sides. Square, 70-30, sitting back 100%, waist is pointed right to the front, turning towards the corner where the rear foot is pointing, shifting forward without turning, turning back to the front. So what this exercise will do is develop a couple things. It'll actually develop your ability to use your quads, your hip joints, and to use the two hip joints differently. In Tai Chi, we don't do the same thing with the two hip joints. So we don't do either of these motions. We don't do a massive plie where both hip joints are open. We don't do whatever you would call the opposite of that, where both of the hip joints are closed, pointing towards each other. The two hip joints are doing different things. So in order to do that, you have to actually be able to use your hip joints. The other thing this will do is it'll give you the skill to understand the difference between your hip joints and your knees. Now everybody says, well, that's absurd. Of course I know that my knees are not the same as my hip joints. Of course I won't just automatically change my knee instead of using my hip joint, or use my hip joint instead of my knee. But people actually don't understand the difference between their knees and their hip joints. So this exercise works them separately. This is not the way we shift in the form, where everything is changing altogether, where as I'm shifting, I'm also turning all the way through there. That's a more advanced way of turning the waist using the hip joints. This exercise is to separate out the hip joints from the knees and to separate the shifting from the turning. So work on this. Don't think this is the way you work in the form, but this will help you do the form better. So there's two motions that the hip joints can make. There's a motion of closing, where the front of the pelvis comes towards the thigh, and there's a motion of opening, where the front of the pelvis moves away from the thigh. If you looked at the elbow, when I close my elbow, the two parts of the arm move towards each other. When I open my elbow, the two parts of the arm move away from each other. This is just like opening or closing a door. If you open a door, the door moves away from the frame. When you close the door moves towards the frame. So the door becomes independent of the frame. The door unifies with the frame. My pelvis turns towards my leg, closing. My pelvis turns away from my leg, opening. So as you work this, start out in a good 70-30. Front hip joint is creased. That means it has closed. Rear hip joint is flat. That means it's open. You sit back and now close the rear hip joint. Draw the pelvis towards the rear thigh. As you do that, the front hip joint will open. Shift towards the front. Now close the front hip joint. Let the rear hip joint open. So work this very carefully so that you get the pieces, so that you can actually see this. A key thing about this is stabilizing the knee that you're standing on. So when I sit back, this knee is fixed. It's not going to move. As I turn over it, and that knee stays in place. Watch for what we call swimming knees, where when I sit back, the knee has collapsed, and as I turn, the knee moves. Not only is that not good Tai Chi technique, it'll hurt your knees fairly quickly. So this exercise is really good if you're having any knee pain at all, to work on it and understand that the knees move independently from the hip joints. Then once you're able to move them independently, you'll be able to move them together. The next piece of this, when I sit back, the rear knee is stable. I'm going to turn turn towards the rear corner, the front knee does not come along. So when I do this, I sit back and I turn. The front knee stays in a line from the hip joint through the knee to the bubbling well. It doesn't collapse and come with me. If it collapses and comes with me, that's a failure in the hip joint. The hip joint didn't open. If I sit back and this hip joint doesn't change, when I turn, that will bring the knee with me. And then when I shift forward, watch where my knee is. This is danger, danger, danger. The knee will move when I turn to the front. So if I get this right, I sit back, the rear knee is stable, I turn towards the rear foot, the front knee is released, it's in a line between the hip joint and the bubbling well, I shift forward, and now the front knee is stable. As I turn, the rear knee moves. So get this working. One hip joint closes, the other hip joint opens. The other hip joint closes, the first hip joint opens. So the two hip joints are doing this. They're moving out of phase with each other. So there's a point where I can freeze frame and the two hip joints will look the same, except this hip joint is opening, this hip joint is closing. So they pass, but they're going in opposite directions. Looks the same, but they're going in opposite directions. Do that with this. I close, this one opens. I come forward, front knee is stable. I close, rear opens. Work this a bunch of times on both sides. Closing, opening. Knee doesn't come with me. Forward, knee is stable. Rear knee will change. Closing, opening. If you do this and you really get your hip joints working and you're not used to this, you'll feel it after you do it. A lot of times people think their hips are out here, which is true. I've got these big flying buttresses, this big support structure on the outside of the pelvis, but that's not the place where the leg turns. The femur, the thigh bone, comes up, and then there's a little piece that sticks into the pelvis, has a knob on the end of it, and the pelvis has a cup that it fits into. So the joint is in here, not out here. So when we say turn the hips, or turn the waist, we mean use the hip joint, not swing the hips around. So this exercise will help you find where your hip joints actually are. Then you can take it into the bear. So in the bear, as I turn one direction, that hip joint is engaging and drawing me that way. The other hip joint is releasing. Now I change in a second. This hip joint closes, engages, and draws me towards that leg, while the other hip joint releases. So there's a yin-yang going on between the two hip joints as you do the bear. If you think your hips are on the outside, you'll swing them around as you do the bear. And watch what's happening to my torso. See how it's moving a lot more? If I work the hip joints, the torso stays in the middle here, and I'm moving back and forth, one hip joint, then the other hip joint. As I do this, the emptying knee moves along the line of the toe, not collapsing in, so that it's in place to hold me when I change. So I just introduced another idea of the hip joints. There's opening and the closing, and there's the active engaged hip joint, and there's the responsive releasing hip joint. So in the bear, one hip joint is engaging while the other is releasing. And then I change in the blink of a thought. Now this hip joint engages, the other hip joint releases. I change, one hip joint engages, the other hip joint releases. So when you're doing the bear, you can pay attention to this, the changing back and forth between the hip joints. So this is really important work. It'll help you actually get to the place where you can use the waist to drive the body. A lot of what happens to us is that our intention, the place we're driving from, is misplaced, so we drive from the shoulders. Watch Beth's video of doing rollback, and you'll see her showing how you can be misdirected. I can be driving from the top rather than the bottom. So we start out keeping this rectangle, shoulders over hips, so that when you turn at the bottom, the top only does what the bottom does, so that you learn when it is that you drive from the wrong place, and you instead learn to drive from the waist and hips. So this is important work. Benlow's third principle. Work on separating empty and full, and work on actually using the hip joints so that you can drive the motions from turning the waist.